Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Jeff Hittner, an executive coach, a leadership expert, and founder of Ambitious Dads. After learning he couldn't become a biological father, Jeff redefined what fatherhood meant and now proudly parents two amazing boys. The former founder and leader of IBM's corporate social responsibility consulting practice and leadership professor at the Bard MBA in sustainability, Jeff has spent 2 decades coaching CEOs and building leadership programs for mission-driven companies. After interviewing more than 200 modern fathers about their challenges, goals, and evolving needs, Jeff coaches high-performing dads to lead with presence, courage, and a version of success worth passing on. Jeff, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited to dive in. So let's start with this concept that you've identified and call the 6 biggest dad gaps, the most significant challenges facing modern fathers today. Could you walk us through what these gaps are and why they seem to be so universal among dads you've worked with?
Yes, absolutely. Well, they came about specifically from having these intense interviews and conversations with all these fathers, and this is what was bubbling up. And what was bubbling up was, first and foremost, like the gap of like this tension, like I don't have, how do I balance all of this? And women have also, of course, had this tension. I don't want to exclude that, but this is explicitly for men, and this tension between like, I want to focus on my career. How do I focus on my career? I want to focus on my kids. I also kind of want to focus on me a little bit. And if I'm married, I want to co-parent well. And how do I do that? And it just kind of keeps evolving. And that was kind of obviously one of the big ones. And then from there, it gets interesting because there's an interesting data point out there that says men for the first time, truly they identify primarily as fathers, those that are dads. But 2/3 of us don't believe that we are very good at it. So the second big gap is this confidence gap that we have as dads. And the challenge with this confidence gap is, as guys, we don't do very well when we don't feel like we're good at something, because it turns into shame, it turns into guilt, it turns into lots of things. So confidence gap is another really big one. Third gap is really, which would probably come as no surprise, is community. Like we call it the brotherhood gap. Like we're not getting together and talking about these things. And even, because I'm working with a lot of dads. I run these programs, one called the Founding Fathers program, where we spend 12 weeks kind of diving into building our own fatherhood philosophy. And these dads will say, like, I go out with other dads. Like we may even have like once a month, like a dad's, trip to the bar or a coffee shop or what have you, but we're not having these deep conversations. And the thing is, there is not a single dad that I've interviewed that doesn't say, like, this is what's keeping me up at night, right? Like something is keeping them up at night. And yet they're not having that conversation. And I will tell you, this brother gap, like I'm so selfish in why I did these interviews, at least to start, because I had all these confidence issues too, right? And these brotherhood issues too. And I had 2 boys. I have 2 boys. About 2 years ago, they started fighting all the time with each other. And I was like, what is wrong with me? Like, how can I not get these 2 kids that I know love each other to stop fighting? And I started doing these interviews, and I asked whichever dads, had boys or were siblings of other guys, because my sibling is a woman, my sister, and they were like, oh no, we fought all the time and we love each other and we have a great relationship now. And it was like that easy. If I had just asked that, it would have saved me months of being frustrated, anxious, felt guilty, shameful, all those things that I just talked about. So that's another big one. Another one is around legacy. And this is really about like seeing the forest through the trees, right? Like as dads, we're pretty reactive, and that we're not reactive when it comes to work. Like when it comes to work, we'll create a strategic plan or a vision or a mission. And then when it comes to our parenting, we're doing none of that. We don't know exactly how we want to lead with our values, or we don't know like how to really like get through the difficult situation by using like a bigger vision of what we're trying to get to with our kids. And the way I describe that is like, for instance, I tell my kids as they kind of move from each sort of age bracket from one to another, what my primary role is as a dad. When they were younger, my primary role, I kept saying, is my role is to keep you safe. And so they would want to do something, and I would say, no, you can't do that. And they would complain, and I'd be like, hey, what's my primary job? And they'd be like, to keep us safe. I'd be like, absolutely. And being able to know that made it easy to change the direction of the conversation. This is what happens when we have like a vision or a roadmap at home as we do at work. So building that sort of from a legacy perspective it was really important. So the other gaps also have to do with kind of our own emotional growth, by the way. So one of the things I've discovered a lot working with all these dads is that we see our own triggers, own stunted emotional development in the tantrums that our kids have, in the moments when we overreact to different situations. So it's like this growth of our own emotional intelligence, and the discovery that our fatherhood, oh my God, is it's kind of the crash course to realizing that we need to do a little work on ourselves. And really, I'm sure you can relate in terms of the work that you do, and is a primary driver of the change that we're seeing with a lot of the men and dads that I work with. So yeah, these are some pretty significant gaps and some pretty significant like fears and opportunities, because in these gaps are also these fears, like this emotional gap. A lot of the dads are afraid that they're going to sort of implant in their children a lot of the issues and challenges they haven't resolved for themselves. But yet they're like deep enough to recognize that and deep enough to want to change that, and also challenged enough from these other gaps that we talk about to have no idea how to do that. Like, who do I talk to about it? I can't talk to other dads about it. Where do I go? And so that's all part of this big journey that I'm trying to support. And as I said, part of it's selfish because I'm learning a ton with every conversation and with every article I write and with every workshop that I run. And part of it is because um, I want to be an incredible dad, and I meet dads all the time that want the same thing, and they just don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, thanks for laying out that blueprint. And, I was struck by a few things. One, I think you were saying essentially like we don't have clear, trustworthy guidance or assessments to know how to address these things. And that's what you're doing. And I appreciate that. I am curious, there's a lot of talk how women tend to naturally step into the motherhood role. And part of that's the biological connection. Part of it's because the model for a mother has been established already, and to your point, in our, this generation being the first to even identify fully, like, oh, I'm a father, I'm playing this full role. I'm curious if you've how much of a role of a father you find is biological or like conditioned and learned.
I have a biased answer because I'm not a biological dad, and I believe the answer is none. And I believe all parenthood, motherhood, and fatherhood is intentional, right? Like maybe at the very beginning, let's say months like 0 to 6 or 0 to 12 for a mom, there is a lot of chemicals. There's a lot of, the child is feeding off the mother in most cases. A lot of that is instinctual, 100%. But when we get past the infant stage and we get into everything that leads us to develop into full-fledged human beings, that there's nothing like natural about knowing how to teach and direct and engage and empathize in this way and that way, and able, now we talk about making sure that our kids know that all their emotions are, it's okay, right? It's okay to have all these different emotions. We don't want to say these emotions are okay to show, these you need to suppress. Like all of that is not natural. We have to learn that. We have to learn that as adults. We have to teach that to kids. So I really believe the biology of parenthood stops very, very young, very, very young. And then the intention of parenthood picks up. And that's where we all need to play our roles and do the research and do our own healing and get the support and have the conversations to be great at it. And one thing that women also do that's just so much better than us is that they've already built a culture of having those conversations with each other, right? So they'll have their, mom's lunch or their mom's night out, but they are talking about what's going on with their kids. And the dads still are just maybe starting to get into that, right? And so in that sense, they have built that in culturally, and we have not.
Yeah. I think that that is the hinge point right there in the impasse that men struggle with. To your point, it is learned just as much outside, beyond those 12 months, equally from a mother to the father. It's just that mothers are willing to talk about it to start that journey of realizing, like you're doing, like I have to learn it. And I think that that's a mindset I find some fathers, not all, struggle with, of like, what's optional, right? Or like, why should I have to learn it? Or how could I learn it? And I think it takes a true dedication, like you're speaking to, that you have to realize this is a non-negotiable necessity, that you need to do the work to figure it out and to talk about it. And honestly, I think when you frame it like a necessity, it's still difficult to break the ice in these conversations with other dads, but it's the motivator that will do it. Anything less than that, you will just continue to tap out and talk about a sports game or informational stuff. And so I think it takes someone stepping into that. I'm curious, so if a guy comes to you and, he's struggling with one or multiple of the gaps, just from your perspective and work, where do you start with them? Do you address like one gap at a time, multiple? How do you help them understand? Yeah, just be curious to hear the beginning stages of your process.
Well, ideally, the best setting for that is a peer setting. So I like to run like programs with many dads together because, again, one of the things that we learn, whether it's as a therapist from your perspective, as a coach from my perspective, is that I'm not here to give answers. I'm here so that people can share what they're going through and then can learn from other people's experiences. So I'll give you a fun example. In our Founding Fathers program, one dad, he had maybe it was his son was maybe 6 months old at the time, and he joined, and he was like so upset with himself, and he's like, guys, I let my son fall off the couch, like he fell off the couch, and I just feel awful. And we were like, well, remind us how old he is. Oh yeah, he's 6 months old. And I was like, everyone in this Zoom call, raise your hand right now you've dropped your son, right? And like half the men raised their hand, right? And it was just normalizing it, right? It wasn't about, oh, this is what you need to do to be better. It was just like, hey, welcome to the club, right? Like, I know you've learned from that. Like, your kid is mobile now, so you're going to have to like think about it differently. And that happens all the time when our child goes from just like pure infancy to starting to be able to move around. And so for me, I've got like an outline of what the conversation should be about in these settings. And so we're talking about everything from our own triggers and emotions to how we build and create traditions for our families to what's like the real new definition you want to have around success with your children and around money. Like, what's your relationship with money and how would you like it to be different for your child? So I'm initiating these conversations, but my ideal scenario is that they're having the conversation with each other. So because that's how men, in my experience, are going to learn. Probably how all of us learn best is, we have the aha moment. Someone doesn't give it to us.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I would raise my hand as well multiple times there. I have a 17-month-old and it's already happened twice. So yeah, I think what you're saying in that points back to something you said earlier of, breaking the shame cycle for men and getting in a group where you can be accepted for who you are, not as like anyone would endorse dropping your kid as like the optimal thing, but essentially accepted as part of the human journey as a father. I think I'd be curious to hear your framework on this concept of what it means to be a good father. After interviewing over 200 fathers, I'm sure you've heard a wide variety of standards and definitions and understandings, perspectives. I think collectively, you also said this earlier, we are almost redefining what it means to be a good father. And of course, every generation kind of collectively and individually defines that. Yeah, let's just start with what your general sense of what it means to be a good father is, and then maybe move into how that may be different from our dad's generation.
Yeah. So and I've asked this question to almost all of these dads, and I'll give you kind of a pretty straightforward answer. For me, it's the difference between a good father and a great father. So, a good father, very generally, is someone that like cares enough that is trying, and for better or for worse, maybe does feel shame or guilt, but is still trying. A great father, the difference between a great father is the one who has intention, as I talked about before, and is intentionally trying to shape their fatherhood journey for their kids. Right. So the great father is the one that says, I want to grow as a dad and I am going to invest in myself to make that happen. So that's what it takes to be a great father. And by the way, that's not that much. If you think about all the other things we invest in, right? It's just a mindset shift. Like, okay, I'm going to invest in that from a fatherhood perspective, the thing that I care about most. But unfortunately, we don't really have the tradition of thinking about it that way. So I really would put it that simply because everyone's definition, when I hear what they have to say, they're all right. There's no wrong definition. So, and again, effort doesn't make you a great father. Effort makes you a good father. What I really have seen and from these conversations is what makes you a great father is doing the work with intention, not just showing up. I think the other clear definition of being a good father would be about presence, would be about showing up.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I'm curious. You mentioned, fathers putting forth that intentionality beyond the effort to really step into the role fully. Obviously, you and I would recommend things like therapy and coaching. What are some other resources? Do you recommend books or podcasts, or do you find that again most of that learning happens in the men's group?
I mean, I think you kind of covered it. I mean, there's definitely, there's social media. There's some great people to follow on social media. And unfortunately, the majority that are talking about the best ways to parent different situations are often moms. But their dads are moving into that space now too. And there's no differentiation in terms of what I think you would get out of that. Then there's some books, but I think the big thing is deep conversations, courses, books. But when people ask like what would be the most impactful thing you could do, I always say therapy for yourself, because we got to start with ourselves if we're going to be a good dad or a good mom, because we bring all of that stuff into our relationships in ways we just don't even realize until we see our poor behavior mirrored in our children in one way or another. And I was definitely that way. And I still make mistakes all the time. But I remember where, in particular, my kids were big into temper tantrums, like really long ones, not like 2 or 3 minutes. I'm talking like 20, 30 minutes. I could not last past a minute before I would just lose my shit. And I quickly started to see like the way I react when I'm frustrated mirrored and how they were reacting. And it was a wake up call. And the process to getting better wasn't just recognizing it, it was a process because part of it was me being triggered. So there was connection to like my inability to, in all likelihood, express those emotions when I was a kid. But it was also like I was getting better, but I could only get to like minute 2 or minute 3 of a tantrum with another 20 to go. So I would tell my wife, I'm sorry, I got to tag out right now because at this point it's going to go downhill for me, and have her be willing to jump in. And she did. And I got better and better and better. And well, now they don't really have them, which is thankful, but I could sit through it. Actually, in fact, just this week, my youngest, this was a fun experience for me. So we were at the dentist, and my after the dentist appointment, they have this little machine because it's a kid's dentist office. You put a coin in it, and then it has this claw that moves, and like you can pick a toy out of the machine. And my son wanted something super specific, and I knew that if he didn't get it, there was going to be a problem. And I just was like in advance prepared for this. I thought about it with intention. And sure enough, this crappy gift came out. He didn't want it. And he lays down on the floor and starts crying. And all the people, there must have been a half a dozen nurses and dentists are walking by like, oh, what can I do? Like, let me just get the toy for him, or let me get another coin. And I super calmly was like, no, like I want my son. I didn't get to the full explanation with them, but I want my son to experience disappointment and be resilient to it. And I had chosen in advance. I mean, it was really luck, but I saw that the situation was going to devolve like that. Like I had chosen in advance that this was going to be a learning situation that I was going to be ready to give. And so sure enough, he eventually got up. I thanked everyone who kept trying, but I said no to all of them. And that's a lot of no's I had to say too, right? And then we walked home, and it was at least a 10-minute walk home with more crying all the way home, and until he finally calmed down. And God, I was really proud of it. I was proud of it because I could have chosen the easy way. And I felt like what I chose was a way that was going to help him become more resilient and like deal with disappointment. And yeah. And I mean, who knows? Maybe in 10 years, he'll remember daddy was a dick at the dentist's office. But for me, that felt like almost the epitome of my growth process, because I was okay from the moment before the tantrum was going to start to when it finished, as opposed to when this started 3 or 4 years ago. I would try to avoid them at all costs because I couldn't handle them.
I'm glad you said that story, and it's very encouraging to me in a few ways. I think what comes up is, I didn't have proper expectations, I think, going into fatherhood. It's like I had good intentions, maybe, of like, I want to be a good father, but I didn't really walk through some of those scenarios that I think upon being in them, yeah, have lost my shit, shook my kid too hard, tapped out, said to my wife, "You need to do this." And what you're getting at is so powerful. I think we as fathers, if you're thinking about having a kid, it's so helpful to, even before the kid arrives, to literally walk through, okay, I know this situation is going to happen like 2 a.m. and me crying, like, how am I actually going to handle that? I use this analogy, like, when you're a kid, you go to fire drills in school and you think, what the hell's the point of this? I'm just leaving the building. I'm talking with my friends. But if a fire broke out, you'd be happy that you know what to do. And I think in the same way, it's really helpful. So on a macro level, but I think what you're getting at on a micro level is that there's all these moments that we have the ability, as we are intentional and being present with our kid, to know our kid, know their habits, know their mindsets, know their personalities, know their triggers, and to take the time to diffuse. I'm sure it wasn't long, but just a few seconds to be like, okay, this is going to happen. And I imagine you do that in your business really well as a coach. You can kind of see when a guy is starting to go down this path or say this, and what may be helpful, at least for me as a therapist, as I've worked with more and more people, you can kind of healthily predict without judging, like, here's what may happen. But I just appreciate you saying that, because I think that's been the biggest shift for me as a father, of resetting my expectations, where my wife just naturally is like, this is how it is. What did you expect? Like, you want 7 hours of sleep, bud? Like, you're not going to get that. But here I am still throwing my own tantrum, like, oh, we got to stop this. And just that rigid thinking that, dominates. So for any guys out there, I just would encourage you, that's the takeaway so far, is certainly how to properly reset expectations, and prepare for some of these situations that, help you show up better as a father.
Yeah, no, we threw out a lot of the baby with the bathwater when so many of us stopped really being like religious in a traditional sense, because there were a lot of interesting things that were built into religious systems, including this idea called pre-Cana in Catholicism, right? Where you actually go and you kind of have a training before you get married. And the same thing would be amazing around starting your family. There's a lot of psychological research that shows that parents are most open to like listening and change in their life as they're expecting a kid, because they expect change. One of the few times like you expect change and you know it's going to be big, right? And you're okay with it because it's a child. So to have some sort of set of opportunity, I mean, my dream is to provide some sort of like programming through businesses and otherwise for like expecting parents. But the bigger challenge around this too, though, is like the hardest part really isn't year 0 to month 12. It's when they do start to be a bit more human like, where like these, where they're like 2.5 and you have to go somewhere and they decide that they want to wear no clothes and it's 20 degrees outside and you're like, but you really have to go, and you're not going. And that idea that like you have to be somewhere and not be late, That's only your concept. That's not your child's. Like, that's the stuff. And the challenge is that's happening not in year 0 or year 1 even. It's like a little bit later as they grow into toddlers, and then more so a little bit past that. So figuring out like how to connect dads and moms with that sort of support and recognize that it's needed, that's where it's tricky. That's where I would love for us to be more open to it and talk about it through our businesses, through our communities, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I've been through pre-K myself. I'm not Catholic, but my wife is, of course, being
I had
from
the same
the Boston.
experience.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I figured your last name.
It's
Yeah,
definitely
it's
not
funny.
Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. That's funny. But yeah, I really appreciated that, thorough preparation that set me up for marriage. In the same way, that was the first big mental shift that my life is not my own. Now the two are becoming one. We could get into a whole nother thing how people don't honor that vow and commitment, and that leads to a whole set of issues. But I agree. I think in order, that's the first primary relationship you should prepare for. But let's just say, you're past that and you're expecting or you have a kid. Yeah, doing that kind of boot camp preparation where, yeah, I agree, offering some sort of onboarding like you would a job. I mean, being a father is a job. There's an onboarding period at the beginning. So, why would we not offer that? And yeah, just shifting gears a bit, I'd love to just dive into your personal unique journey as a father, which was unconventional, of not being able to biologically have kids, as you mentioned earlier, but redefining what fatherhood meant to you. How has that personal experience shaped the way you coach other dads who might be struggling with their own definition of success and identification as a father?
When I obviously I went through like a whole grieving process, right? When you find out that you can't have something that you dreamed about your whole life, and that process, moves from grief to deciding, well, if I still want to be a father, how do I transform my definition of it? And part of that process for me was actually like mourning. Sounds strange, but I knew from day one that my children were now going to be imperfect. And turns out that that was the biggest gift I could have had, because when we think about our kids as perfect, we just think of like, they're just this canvas that is, there's no imperfections there, and like and then we hold on a little too tight, and everything we do, we judge ourselves. And for me, I remember, and I've written about this, I remember like crying at the beach thinking like, when my kids turn 13 and are like searching for their identity, they are going to have this huge complication, and like, I have created this, or I will have created this for them, and how shitty is that? And coming to terms with that was actually amazing for me, because it really was, as I say, it was freeing, because like, okay, I'm not perfect already as a dad, and they're not perfect already as kids. And as a result, I think I can be a little bit better at making mistakes and not shaming myself, and making mistakes and like researching and trying harder. So I think that's what I kind of transfer into the relationships and the coaching that I do with other fathers and executives. It is really this idea like that we are going to be so imperfect at this. This is so hard. Like, let's embrace that, because it's a gift. With my kids in particular, I have this story where my kids were asleep in the back of the car. I forget where we were driving back from, and so I put in like some Tony Robbins podcast because it was about fatherhood and I was curious. And maybe 20 minutes in, I turn around and my oldest is awake and listening. And I was like, "Hey, bud, do you know? Do you understand what they're talking about?" And he's like, "Yeah, they're talking about like how to be a better dad." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, that's right. Like, because I always want to be better at something that's like the most important thing in my life." And I realized that I could start to lean into that. And so my kids know that I'm trying to always be better at being a dad. And they also know that I apologize a lot. So, like, we are really good at repair in our house. And it's funny because, like, my kids will have, they'll get upset and they'll still scream and yell because, of course, they're kids and they're still figuring out their emotions. And when that ends, I will get the biggest bear hug, like, and it may be 5, 10, 20 minutes later, but I feel like that exists because we've gone through this process and because we talk about it's okay to mess up and we just have to own it and like apologize and move forward. So I think all of that stuff is what I'm able to kind of carry into the work that I do as a result of my experience.
Yeah. And I'm glad you named that. The sin of perfectionism really keeps you from healthily modeling to your kids what they will also do. As your kids mess up, your ability to apologize helps them realize that. And that was a big shift for me in my marriage, even. I'm from the South and we are usually conflict avoidant. And everything has to be nice and kind of peachy. And, it was through my therapy training and being married to my wife, who's a bit more like, let's duke this out and put on the gloves, that I really learned that, the temporary rupture is intentionally done and effectively done, let's say, really creates long term sustainable connection and non rupture. And when you can frame it like that the mistakes, the I'm sorries, the I missed the mark, all those kind of things are actually the very training ground to strengthen, just like muscles, tearing the muscle to rebuild it, to strengthen your relationships with your kids and your spouse. I think that's it. And it's something a lot of us men, including myself, really struggle with, like getting the I'm sorry out, it sometimes takes a minute. And I think your framework helps us normalize the suck and psychologically knowing if we can properly predict that it's going to be worse than we think it is in a way. It one usually turns out that it's not as bad as we think it is, but two, it keeps us from idolizing this like false, like non-failure, non-mistake, non-messy way of being a father, which is actually like not even possible. And then we live in perpetual disappointment. Like, my kids are a mess, I'm a mess, like my family's a mess. And yeah, I just think that way you framed it is so empowering.
Thank you. Yeah, and it is a snowball effect, right? Like, yeah, this shame cycle, and also depending on because as dads, if we are still in more of a traditional job, we're not seeing our kids until I write about it, I call it like parenting on the fringes of the day. So like we are our best selves, unfortunately, like during the core of the day when we're not in front of our kids, right? So, and unless you're I'm a super morning person, but unless you're a super morning person, like you're up with your kids, you haven't had your coffee yet, like everything's all over the place, and you're dealing with them in that setting. And by the way, they're extra irrational in those moments depending on how old they are. And then you send them off to school, and then you're finally, the coffee's kicking in, and like finally you're able to be clear and think and have some energy, but your kids aren't around. And then you work your ass off all day, and then it's time to see your kids again, and you're exhausted, right? And then you put all this pressure on yourself to be great at it, and you still got stuff going on in your head from what was happening during the day, and maybe your phone's still going off in your pocket, and like it's just all adding to your big giant bucket of shame. And like the truth is, we just need to start to recognize some of these things, that we're in a system that makes it impossible to be perfect as parents. So let's be a little bit less hard on ourselves, and then figure out the moments that we can like show up for them. And if that's fewer moments, that's also fine. Like our kids don't have a stopwatch to say you were only with me 22 minutes instead of 45 minutes. It's like the 22 minutes I just spent with you, I was giggling and laughing and having the best time. And like, that's what they remember.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And let's go ahead and talk about that tension of, career and parenthood. So you work specifically with high performing, ambitious dads, as in the name, who are used to excelling in their careers. What are some unique challenges these fathers may face when trying to apply that same drive and success that they're seeing when the coffee does kick in at work, and mindset to, parenting when they're on the fringes?
Well, the unique challenge is they're not applying the same like leadership thoughts and ideas, right? So, my kind of general metaphor is how they think about leading their teams, how they think about giving feedback, how they think about coaching, all that stuff goes out the window when they are home, right? So I'll give you an example that I did this too. So out of nowhere, about a month ago, my youngest started putting his hands over his ears when he didn't want to like get lectured. And it was happening after he did something wrong to his big brother. Usually he hit him or kicked him or did something. And I would come in and I would be frustrated and I would be like, "What did you just do? Like, tell me what happened." And he would just go like this. And I was like, shoot, this is like some new trend. I need to look this up. I'm sure this means something. And by pure coincidence, that day I was running a leadership training around how to give great feedback. And one of the most important first steps, like from a work perspective, is you need to ask permission first to give feedback. Because if you ask or don't ask and that person isn't ready for feedback, they aren't going to hear it at all. Right. And I realized in that moment, my son is giving me the best gift of all. He is saying, don't even think about trying to teach me something right now. And that's what it was. So puts his, I break him up from fighting with his brother. I just say, we're going to talk about this later. Right. And I don't deal with it with him in that moment because he's like this. He doesn't want to hear anything in that moment. And that's the example. Because that's what's happening in so many different capacities. Like we have the skills. If we didn't, we wouldn't be good at our work, particularly if we run big teams. But we don't know how to apply that at home. And even if we did, our own emotions get in the way. Right. So there's a bunch of stuff that make it difficult. And so first, just recognizing like, hey, you do have those skills is a important step. And then, hey, how would you apply those skills at home? Interesting. Okay. So that's kind of one of the starting points, which has been really fun and interesting.
Yeah. I appreciate that. In the trenches story, a real life example, I always say in therapy that resistance is code for not ready. And whether that non-readiness is appropriate is a different story. But either way, like you're saying, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to really meet someone where they're at. And, I found that even in my marriage and yeah, now as a parent, that's vulnerable because it means you're out of control. You can't force someone to do what you want or to, yeah, respond that would even resolve the situation. And it takes a radical trust to say, the temporary pause allows your son time to re-regulate, to actually be in a position where he can receive the feedback. I think you make a really good point, and something I try to joke with my clients when they hear me say something somewhat wise or enlightened. I say, don't worry, I'm going to get off this session and then ignore the same advice that I just gave
Yeah.
you. And I'll probably be apologizing to my wife. So but I think in that, it just is such a good reminder, Jeff, that who you are at work is the same person you are at home in a sense. Now the role changes, but you're that same man. And I think if we started taking serious our need to apply skills to work, and the incentive is obviously like income and job security, and with the kids, it's this sense of relationship equity and presence. Like we just have to see that as like this is serious enough to apply these things and learn. And I've talked to some other guests about this. It's really simple, but when you come home, it's just telling yourself, okay, I'm taking off work hat but putting on dad hat, but using those same skills to say, okay, like getting home from work, my job isn't done. The job just changes. And I think, including myself, sometimes I get into that pitfall, right? I'm like, oh, I'm gassed from work. I've like been all day. Like now I'm just dealing with my kids. Now I'm just like, let me make sure and send this work email, or let me just kind of, he's there. Oh, he's like not jumping off the couch, kamikaze style. Like, cool, we're okay. And I think you said this earlier. It's a real challenge to say, nope, like I need to shut the laptop. I need to like get out of this mindset of holding on to that role I was just doing, realize I have a new job that I need to step into. I have that capacity to do it and apply those skills, to that role as a father.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really spot on. And also, I think there's way too many of us as dads that are two different people at home and at work. And that's also extra exhausting. And the thing is, particularly in America these days, we have so little extra time and space, and which means our energy is so depleted, right? Everything. We have to work extra hard for every dollar. And as a result, like if we are two different people at home and at work, we're just like gassing ourselves like when we don't have the reserves to do that with. So if we can feel so much more aligned in our values and how we think about expressing them in both contexts, because it goes both ways. We learn so much as dads that we can bring to work and make us better listeners, more empathetic, all sorts of skills, patience, and so it's all there for us to integrate. But the tradition has not been to be that way, and we're changing that. We're changing that. All sorts of new professions and work from home and all that is changing that, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah. And I'm glad you named the cultural component. And it is a sacrifice, whether that's financially or, laddering up in the career world to, I mean, really what it comes down to asking yourself is what matters most to me. Because at the end of the day, you only have so much time. And if you're working 70-hour weeks and you're an excellent employee, it's gonna be near impossible to also be an excellent dad. It's just, you're limited, you're tapped out, you don't have that much time. And it's not a right or wrong, it's just figuring out, okay, they both matter. What's the balance and how do I express these values? But I agree. I feel that living here in the States of even when I do have the time, you feel guilty for taking it, which obviously in Europe, it's the opposite. They're totally cool with it, which I am envious of. And yeah, I just think that's something to keep in mind. Really important is to say, we work so hard to live this life, but what is the actual life we're living and does it reflect the values of what I want to also model my kids? It's like if my dad's always gone at work, what does that say about him and our relationship and our family? So
Absolutely. And to be honest, from the other side too, I'm rather curious like what it will be like for my kids in this generation that have not stay at home, but work from home dads. So like I'm there to pick them up from the bus, right?
yeah, it's true.
It's summertime, like, I kind of redirect how my work schedule is. So we spend days together and it's the middle of the week. Like I didn't grow up with a dad that did that. Right. And I'm super curious what that will mean for the relationships between kids and dads going forward, the ones that do work from home, because it's different. And that's another very cool thing about what's evolving with this generation of what we call modern fatherhood.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm curious too. We'll certainly find out together.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd love to end on this last question, which you frame as talking about, having a presence, courage, and a version of success worth passing on. So, how do you help guys define that vision and version of success and what it means in light of fatherhood specifically? We covered what the difference between a good dad and a great dad, but I think we're talking about, finding out long term the repercussions of how present or not present we are. But how can a guy start to put together a vision of success as a father? What does that look like?
I think it starts by understanding what the current definition is inside their head, not the one that they might even think that they want, but what's the one that they're actually playing by right now? Like really being honest enough to be like, okay, right now, based on where my time goes and where my energy and where my money goes, like my definition of success is this. But what do I really want it to be? And again, the hard part is like they may not be able to admit what they want it to be for themselves. So we jump sometimes to, okay, so now you've told me what your definition of success is based on like your actions and your spending, right? We're still not talking about like your idealized view or what you think it should be. Now tell me what you want it to be for your child. Okay, so now you've got what you're doing and what you want it to be for your child. Let's figure out where the gaps are in there in your own life. And so I kind of tease it out that way so that they can really start to figure out what they want or need to change.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. It reminds me of this framework I use about values is you have aspirational values and lived values. And you have
Yeah.
things you may think you care about. I use this easy example of reading. I used to say, oh, I love reading, right? And all these books had dust on them. I never picked them up. It's like aspirational. Now I try to read every day, even if it's just a few pages that's lived. And it takes a humility to really see where you're at versus where you wish you were. Again, like fighting off that shame and need to live in the ideal, and then saying, okay, if I was to take the next step to work towards that, what would it look like? But I like your approach because it also doesn't say, well, like, oh, where I'm at is it. It gives you things to work towards and say, yeah, this is a good goal. Like this year, you want to be more patient. Let's say you don't want to lose your shit as much with your kid. Let's make that a goal from now, for the next year And I think just laddering that up, and then, every year or essentially like level of goal that you're meeting, you just continue to work towards that next thing that is somewhere in between, like not changing at all and like never being able to reach the change in a way that feels like dignified and worthy. So yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that.
No, thank you. And this is hard work. It's hard work because it requires vulnerability, and that vulnerability requires a safe space. And there are far too many men and dads that don't even know what that feels like. So hopefully, these types of conversations can drive more men to beyond that fear into the curiosity zone so they can see it for themselves.
Yes, I agree. Part of that hope can be expressed through participating in amazing resources which you offer. So I'm curious where people can find your work.
Yes. Go to ambitiousdads.com and you can find everything, including the podcast with the same name, which is the Ambitious Dads Podcast.
Okay, cool. We'll put all that in the show notes. And Jeff, thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom as a father. I'm very excited to learn together and continue to define and improve what it means to be one.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Wes.